They mocked the deaf bride's arrival, until the rancher spoke up. "She's worth more than any of you." Chapter 1. The Silent Bride. The dust rolled like smoke over the small frontier town of Willow Creek as the church bell tolled. The townsfolk gathered outside, their chatter sharp as cactus spines. News had spread fast. The richest rancher in 3 counties, Rancher Luke Harding, was marrying a deaf woman. "She can't even hear her own vows," one woman whispered, fanning herself with a lace handkerchief. Another snorted. "What kind of wife will she be? A mute sitting at his table." The laughter echoed off the wooden walls of the church. Yet inside, Evelyn, the bride, stood tall in a simple ivory dress she'd sewn herself. Her dark hair was braided neatly, and though her eyes couldn't hear the cruelty outside, she felt it, in the way people's gazes lingered, in the pitying smiles. Evelyn had been deaf since birth. The world of sound was one she'd only imagined, the rustle of wind, the low hum of cattle, the deep voice of the man she was about to marry. But she had learned to understand people through the way they moved, the way their lips shaped words, and the way their eyes spoke when their mouths lied. Luke Harding wasn't a man of many words, but when he saw her years ago, standing beside her late father's stall at the county fair, something about her calm defiance had struck him deeper than any song or sermon ever could. Now, as she took his arm at the altar, she looked up and smiled, a soft, radiant smile that silenced even his restless heart. Outside, a drunk ranch hand scoffed, "A deaf bride for a rich man. Guess he needed someone who won't argue." The church erupted in stifled laughter. But when the preacher asked for vows, Luke turned to her. Instead of whispering words she couldn't hear, he took her hands gently, traced the words into her palm. "I choose you, always." Tears shimmered in her eyes. She traced back, "I will never leave you." A hush fell over the room. Even those who'd mocked her earlier felt the weight of that silent exchange. The air seemed to still, filled with something far stronger than sound, understanding. And when Luke finally turned to face the whispering crowd outside, his voice thundered like the sky before a storm. "She's worth more than any of you who laughed," he roared. "Not because she can't hear you, but because she doesn't need to hear lies to know what's in a man's heart." The laughter died. Heads bowed. And Evelyn, holding her bouquet of wildflowers, walked past them with the quiet dignity of a queen. That evening, the sun melted behind the Harding ranch, painting the sky in gold. Evelyn sat on the porch, watching Luke ride in with the last of his men. He dismounted and came to her, resting his hat on her lap. "I reckon they'll talk for a long time," he said softly, knowing she couldn't hear. But she saw his lips move, read his words, and smiled. Then she took his hand and placed it over her heart. "I hear you here." The world was silent, but for them it was full of meaning. The Storm and the Promise, extended edition. The first months of their marriage rolled by like warm summer wind. Evelyn had settled into her new life at Harding Ranch, a world of open skies, galloping horses, and quiet peace. Though she could not hear the neighs or whistles, she felt the rhythm of life through the vibrations of the ground, the hum of wind brushing against her face, and the tender touch of Luke's hand on her shoulder whenever he came near. Each morning, the ranch would wake before dawn. The ranch hands would gather near the barn, their boots crunching over the dirt, and Luke would walk among them, tall and steady, his deep voice commanding but kind. Evelyn would watch from the porch, holding a cup of warm coffee, smiling faintly as she saw how they respected him. Some of the men still whispered when they thought she couldn't see. "She don't belong here," Wade, the foreman, muttered one morning. "How's she supposed to run a ranch when she can't even hear a horse neigh?" Luke, passing by, stopped in his tracks. "She doesn't need ears to lead, Wade," he said evenly. "She's got more sense and courage than most men I've met." Evelyn didn't catch the words, but she saw the firmness in Luke's stance. Later, when she asked him what was said, he simply wrote on a piece of paper, "You're stronger than they'll ever understand." And she smiled, tracing the word stronger with her fingertip before slipping the note into her apron pocket. The night of the storm. By late autumn, the land had grown dry, and the sky heavy with tension. The ranchers whispered of a coming storm, the kind that could split trees and sweep herds away like toys. That evening, a purple haze gathered over the horizon. Luke and his men worked fast, rounding up the cattle, securing the fences. Evelyn helped prepare lanterns and blankets, her hands moving fast, her heart pounding though she couldn't hear the thunder rolling in the distance. When the first flash of lightning cracked across the sky, the horses reared and whinnied. Evelyn felt the tremor in the floorboards. She looked out the window, saw Luke on horseback, shouting orders she couldn't hear but could see in his body's urgency. Then she noticed the north gate, wide open, and beyond it, several calves lost in the rising rain. Without a second thought, Evelyn grabbed her shawl and ran out. The wind howled, she couldn't hear it, but it pushed against her with such force that it nearly knocked her down. The rain turned the world into a blur. Mud swallowed her boots. Her dress clung to her body as she stumbled through the dark. She found one calf tangled in barbed wire near the fence, bleeding and terrified. Evelyn dropped to her knees, ignoring the sharp sting of the wire slicing her palm. She worked desperately to free it, whispering words she could not hear, her lips moving, praying that it would live. Her fingers bled, her breath came ragged. But when the final strand of wire snapped, the calf stumbled free. Evelyn guided it toward the barn, shielding it with her body from flying debris. Suddenly, a flash of light and a deafening explosion of thunder split the sky. Evelyn didn't hear it, but she felt it through her bones. The fence pole crashed beside her, scattering sparks. A strong arm yanked her backward. It was Luke. His face was pale with fear, his hat gone, hair drenched, eyes wild. He shouted her name, his mouth moving, "Evelyn!" But she could only see the panic. He grabbed her face, forcing her to look at him. She signed with trembling hands. "The calf, it's safe." Luke exhaled sharply, shaking his head. "You could have been killed," he said, voice breaking, but his tone softened as he pulled her close, pressing his forehead to hers. The rain poured down on them, washing the mud and blood away. When they returned to the ranch, soaked to the bone, the men stared in stunned silence. They'd all seen her run into the storm, seen her bravery, her fierce determination. That night, Luke wrapped her hands in bandages, his fingers gentle on her wounds. He looked into her eyes, guilt and awe mingling in his expression. "I thought I'd lost you," he murmured. "I don't ever want you running into a storm again." She smiled faintly and wrote on his palm, "You'd do the same." He couldn't argue. He only kissed her forehead, holding her close until the thunder faded into the distance. The days that followed. By morning, the storm had passed, leaving the land shining and soaked under a silver dawn. News spread through Willow Creek like wildfire, how the deaf bride had saved part of the Harding herd. People who once mocked her began to speak her name with respect. When Evelyn rode into town beside Luke a few days later, folks stepped aside. Mrs. Jenkins, the same woman who had laughed at the wedding, pressed a pie into Evelyn's hands and stammered, "You're a brave woman, Mrs. Harding." Evelyn smiled and nodded, signing thank you, even though the woman didn't understand. But the gesture, the warmth, was enough. Soon, children from town began visiting the ranch. Evelyn taught them sign language, shaping words with her hands and teaching them how to listen with their hearts instead of their ears. Luke built her a small wooden workshop by the cottonwoods, a place filled with sunlight and quiet. She carved wooden boards with simple phrases. "Love needs no sound. Strength speaks in silence." He'd often find her there in the evenings, sleeves rolled up, wood shavings in her hair. Sometimes she'd look up, and he'd sign clumsily, "Beautiful." She'd laugh, correcting his hand shape, then kiss his fingers for trying. The town's festival. Months later, the annual Willow Creek Harvest Festival arrived. It was the same event where Luke had first seen her years ago, when she'd stood silently by her father's stall, her eyes filled with quiet pride. This time, she stood beside Luke, her husband, her heart full. The townsfolk gathered around as the mayor made a speech, and then, to everyone's surprise, Luke stepped forward. He signed to Evelyn before turning to the crowd. "You all laughed once when she walked through those doors," he said, voice firm but calm. "You thought silence meant weakness. But she's shown every one of you, and me, what strength truly looks like." He reached for her hand, raising it before the crowd. She hears the things most of us never stop long enough to notice: the kindness in a gesture, the truth in a person's eyes, the love that don't need words. The crowd fell silent. Even the wind seemed to pause. Evelyn blinked back tears, her heart thundering in her chest. As the sun dipped low and the sky turned to fire, Luke turned to her and signed, slowly but surely, "You are my sound in a world gone quiet." She touched his cheek and replied, "And you are my peace in a world too loud." The crowd erupted in applause, not mockery this time, but pure admiration. That night, as stars blanketed the sky, Luke and Evelyn sat on the porch, her head resting on his shoulder. Fireflies danced over the fields. She looked up and traced words into his palm. "I never needed sound to find love. I only needed you." Luke smiled, kissing her hand. "And I never needed noise to know your heart." The prairie stretched before them, silent and endless, but between their hands, a language deeper than any words flowed. A love story written not in sound, but in touch, courage, and faith.